My talk title was Adam, Identity and the Gospel, and I think one of the huge issues for us today is the whole issue of identity. Who am I? Because you find people struggling with this, and you see it in issues of social media and stuff where people are trying to sort of create an identity for themselves. They're trying to give themselves some worth by being more popular, by being more liked by everyone else. You see it in issues of trying to be more beautiful or just trying to succeed, the pressure particularly on young people for exams. And I think this great problem over identity has come because we've lost the biblical foundation of our human identity. And in the evolutionary way of thinking, we have no intrinsic value. We're what I would call meat in motion. That's all we are. Yeah. And so if you want to have some worth for yourself, you have to create that. So what I was trying to argue yesterday was that biblical understanding of us as human beings, as the image of God, comes from a real historical Adam from whom we're descended. Because there's a lot of, if you like, Adam is our link to our human identity. That's why he matters so much. And I was trying to contrast what I think is the biblical position, where Adam is the historical ancestor of every human being. If you like, Adam had no parents. He was the first man, and we are all descended from him. Contrast that with a view where you maybe have a historical person, Adam, but he's just one among many. He's amongst a vast human population, and God picks him out for some special purpose. And I was trying to argue that if you do that, you actually lose what it really means to have that human identity. Right, I've just produced this booklet called Adam or Death, which came first. And here I'm trying to, if you like, give a bit of a methodology of how we should approach this topic as Christians. And I'm beginning with the whole idea of chronology in the Bible. It's a topic that's not really in fashion in churches today, but in the past, lots of very famous Christians, people like Martin Luther, spent great effort in constructing a chronology from the Bible because they thought it was talking about real history. And I think we find within the Bible itself, chronology is really important. For Paul, he constructs his theology in terms of the order of events. For example, he talks about the priority of faith over law because Abraham comes before Moses, and that matters to his whole theological argument. And I was trying to extend that idea to how we think about creation. And I think one of the most obvious examples of that is how we understand the history of death. Because in evolutionary history, death has always been present. It's always been there. It's just a natural part of life. But what I would argue is that in the Bible, death comes from Adam's sin. So death was not there at the beginning. It's an intruder that's come through Adam's sin. And that is why Jesus himself had to physically die on the cross to deal with our sin. His physical death is part of the payment of sin. So that's an example of where I think the chronology really matters. It matters for how we answer the sort of questions people have today. Because if your question is why is there all this death and suffering, and you say, well, actually God made it like that at the beginning, I think you have a bit of a problem with the goodness of God. Whereas if you can say, well, actually, no, this is the result of human sin, God's goodness is preserved, and that's a really key thing in our apologetic today. And I also have a little section at the end talking about the scientific issues. How do we address the scientific problems that this view will create? Because undoubtedly there's all sorts of scientific issues we need to address, and I try and give if you like, a method of how we can do that. It doesn't give all the answers, but it's an approach as to how we can get the answers to these questions. I think nationality is a really interesting issue, and it's obviously a very pressing issue in our world today where it can be the source of all sorts of trouble. But I think that the Bible's view is much more nuanced than that. When Paul talks about our new identity in Christ, he talks about people no longer being Jew or Gentile, and even in terms of their work, slave or free, he says, your identity is in Christ. But he also talks about your identity as male and female is no longer the sort of the primary thing. Again, that is subsumed under Christ. And so I think the view we have is that identity is a layered sort of thing. There's lots of levels of our identity. You know, just thinking of myself personally, yes, I'm a Christian. I'm also English in the sense I'm born in England. I have my mum's from Switzerland. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a pastor. I have lots of different sorts of identity. But Paul's point is our primary identity is that in Christ. And I think when it comes to nations, you could say at one level they've come maybe as a result of sin because of the Tower of Babel. That is why we have the different nations today. But I think God has a rather more has taken that and transformed that in Christ, so that in the book of Revelation we find that we have a whole great company of people that are described as coming from different nations, coming together, united in Christ, but I think keeping aspects of their national identity. And that's all been redeemed in Christ. And I think the glory of that is we see something of the diversity of humanity. If we were all just simply one culture, one nation, you know, food would be less interesting, language would be less interesting, lots of things would be less interesting. And I think that diversity in humanity reflects the sort of diversity we find in God and the creativity. And it's used in a right way. It's something to be celebrated.
Yeah, you should. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you.